One of the issues faced in game design is how a developer goes about challenging their players, which can include a number of factors, like mechanics, difficulty, and maybe even some RNG. The next step is finding meaningful ways for rewarding a player for their triumphs. But there are some certain situations where these rewards feel less like a reward and more like a compensation, which depends on how the challenges are given to the player. The definition of compensation is something, typically money, awarded to someone as recompense for loss, injury, or suffering. In Spelunky, this refers to a prize given for overcoming an obstacle, and usually comes in the form of items or gold. The reason these can sometimes feel like compensation is because of how Spelunky presents some of its challenges, which can essentially be boiled down into two categories: voluntary and involuntary. When a game that's already difficult throws you a curveball, it can sometimes feel unfair and frustrating, and it's these involuntary scenarios that make your spoils seem more like a reimbursement for having to face something beyond your control. One of the most significant ways in which the concept of involuntary obstacles is utilized in Spelunky is in something known as level feelings. On top of the uncertainty of randomly generated levels, there is a possibility that it'll also include a level feeling, which is an event or theme that changes the level in some way. These events are signaled by a unique phrase at the beginning of the level. As an example, entering the jungle to the phrase "I hear rushing water" means that the bottom floor of the level has become submerged in piranha-infested water. Now, in my early days of exploring this game, I only saw these events as meaningless difficulty spikes, thrown in for no other reason than to make the game even more challenging than it already is.
Earthquake test! He's good. With my help, he could be the best.
But as I encountered these situations more and more, I found that the game was actually compensating me for successfully tackling them. The significant obstacles I faced weren't there purely to slow me down from achieving my goal, but were instead giving me various tools to help me make it to the end of the game. But it was clear that I had to prove myself in these miniature challenges in order to receive the spoils. In the first world, the mines, one level feeling you might come across is the Snake Pit event. When this happens, the level will include a vertical shaft with enemies, items, and gold lining the walls. And what this pit always includes is the Maddock item, buried beneath the snakes at the bottom. It's useful for getting to hard-to-reach areas without having to waste bombs, and provides some small value outside of the other valuables you might find in there. Now, this isn't the only place you can find the Maddock, but the event guarantees that one is available, so the game is essentially saying, I've thrown in some new, interesting stuff because I feel like it, but there's something in it for you. But this is one of the less frustrating level feelings to come across, because the player can still decide to just avoid it altogether and make it to the exit without dealing with it. Sometimes the event encompasses the whole stage, leaving you less able to avoid confrontation. An example in the jungle world is the Restless Dead event, which coats the level in a light fog, as well as introducing some new enemies, items, and even an exit to a unique level. The vampires that appear in this level are energetic and a bit resilient, but they do drop a cape item when killed. Also in this level will be a gravestone with the name Ash, which hides a shotgun underneath. There's also the Crystal Skull, which grants a significant amount of gold, but also summons the Ghost, and the King's Crown, which is worth a hefty sum, can only be found in this mausoleum, which also hides the only entrance to the secret Haunted Castle level. So in throwing you for a loop with a randomized event, the game is really presenting you an opportunity to acquire hard-to-get and even otherwise unattainable items. But even here, some of the challenges are still voluntary because you don't necessarily have to interact with the unique features to make it to the end of the level. It's different with the darkness level feeling. This one became the event that I grew to dread more than any other, as it would force me to juggle the torch and whatever item I was holding at the time. I'd often find myself taking so much unnecessary damage in these levels to the point where I'd just have to restart out of frustration. But what this event does is it compounds multiple layers of rewards within one stage. During this event, the entire stage is no longer lit and the player needs to navigate through the dark. The level first compensates you by providing a torch at the beginning of the stage, which lights up a small area around itself. A player can hold it, illuminating the surrounding area, or they can toss it to a location to reveal what's up ahead. Throwing the torch, however, means that it may end up falling further down into the level, ultimately leaving the player in the dark. Throughout the level, there are several stationary torches that can also be lit by your own, which not only light up their own area, but provide a small amount of gold upon being lit. Now this incentivizes the player to keep track of the torch and not mindlessly chuck it through the level, as they can benefit themselves by lighting up as much of the level as possible. However, holding on firmly to the torch means two things. First, every large jump is of considerable risk, as traps and enemies are hidden in the darkness. The second consequence is that any held item that the player has now needs to be left behind or juggled with the torch. The level has provided the player the tools needed to traverse the stage more safely, with an incentive to keep that tool, but at the possible expense of a valuable item, leading to another decision. And with this level feeling comes a similar feature to the torch, the Golden Scarab. While not being a held item and not asking that the player juggle them with the other items, they can be found flying around the stage, lighting up the area around them, and when picked up, provide a sizable amount of gold. However, when the player grabs them, the area is no longer illuminated, so the player must again decide, do I risk plunging the area into darkness for money, or do I forfeit the gold and use the scarab to my advantage? The amount of gold is actually significant in this case, and can therefore be a legitimate benefit to players in search of high finance. Now, as already mentioned, the second type of challenge that a player will face is the Voluntary challenge, in which you can decide whether or not to face it head-on, or avoid the confrontation. As I mentioned, these types of challenges can also be found in and amongst the involuntary events like the Snake Pit, but many of them are found in the standard levels as well. And this brings us to the risk-reward equation, which looks something like this. If we look at it as a spectrum, on one end the player can try to avoid any and all conflict with as many obstacles as possible, and be left with a theoretically small amount of resources to work with. On the other end, the player can try to squeeze every last collectible out of every last corner of every last stage, rendering them theoretically better off than if they didn't take the challenges. Now, Spelunky certainly isn't the first game to employ the risk-reward system. Doom 2016, for example, uses the idea of taking risks for a payoff as one of its core game mechanics in the form of the glory kill. This mechanic rewards the player for being bold enough to tackle obstacles head-on rather than trying to play the safe long-range game. You're required to get up close and weave your way in and out of enemies in order to take advantage of your glory kills, and as a compensation, the game rewards you with health and ammo drops. Now, you don't have to approach enemies in this way, but you may end up being better off if you do, and this is the type of game design that often leads to varied and interesting gameplay through decision-making and contrasting philosophies between players who are trying to succeed. My favorite example of the Voluntary challenge is the Golden Idol, and while it can spawn in each area of the caves, I want to take a look at the variation that spawns in the mines. In the ice caves or the jungle, the idol is placed upon a precarious platform of some sort, forcing you to take quick action when grabbing it. This, however, is the beginning and end of the interaction, as the trap doesn't really have a large-scale effect on the entire level. When you move the idol in the mines, however, the caves will rumble and a giant boulder will be released, blasting through the head of the statue in the background and crushing everything in its path, and it will roll through the level until it loses enough momentum to come to a full stop. This seemingly straightforward interaction between a trap and the level completely changes the simple decision of whether or not to pick up the idol, as there are so many implications a player needs to consider regarding the outcome of that decision. And this brings us back to the risk-reward equation. The first thing that needs to be asked is collecting gold my goal? Because if that's not the objective, there's essentially no need to bother with it. Now, let's assume a player decides they want to collect gold. Is there a goal in mind? A number they would like to reach? Do they need to buy items? Do they want a high score? And if there is a quantifiable number they would like to reach, do they specifically need to take the risk of releasing a boulder if they don't need to? That is to say, if there is a goal, is the idol necessary to reach it? If the answer is yes, the player now needs to consider the possible outcomes of setting off the trap and ask themselves, do I have a means of escape? Am I going to have to juggle items now? And a major question is, are there valuables on other floors that I don't want to get crushed? Will I kill the damsel? Will I crush gems and gold? Will I destroy items? Will I destroy the key or chest? Will I destroy an altar and anger Kali? Will I set off the shopkeeper? And most importantly, do I care about any of those things? What's cool is there are so many considerations to be made for this single decision. The reward is a decent amount of gold this early in the caves, which can prove to be a valuable asset when coming across a shopkeeper with an attractive storefront, so the number of risks should be accounted for when approaching this situation. And this is not to say that crushing the level is necessarily negative. Perhaps the player sees the boulder not as a threat, but as something to be desired. Maybe you're new to the game and, like myself, don't want to deal with the enormous jumping spider on the next floor because, it's a giant spider, and you don't like those. Or perhaps you have already angered a shopkeeper in a previous level and you don't mind destroying his business again for your gain. Regardless of what you ultimately decide, there are still so many questions to be asked and variables to be considered in this one interaction, which makes it an excellent case to show how a game designer can create a multitude of experiences from a single decision. While almost every game involves decisions at some level, the nature of Spelunky and the fact that any hit the player takes could be fatal gives these decisions so much more weight and meaning. This gameplay design creates so many possible outcomes that it has me coming back time and time again, so I'm hoping to see more of it not only in Spelunky 2, but other games as well. But that's all for now, so until next time, thanks for watching, and later days.